Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, July 1945, a petition is drafted and circulated throughout the Truman administration. It is written by physicist Leo Szilard and signed by 70 scientists working on the Manhattan Project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the laboratory and the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago, Illinois. The petition ultimately was a plea to consider the moral consequences of nuclear development and the growing plan to drop a nuclear weapon on Japan to try and bring an end to World War II. The petition argued that if the bomb were dropped, the United States would, quote, bear the responsibility of opening the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. This is, of course, such a fraught moment in history, politically, technologically, morally. There were all sorts of voices arguing for the moral justification for dropping the bomb, the moral justification for not dropping the bomb. We will get into all of that, but suffice it to say, the Szilard Petition did not prevent the deployment of nuclear weapons. The petition actually reportedly never made its way to Truman's desk. It was only declassified about 15 years later. And of course, later that summer, August 6th, a weapon was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, and then Nagasaki, Japan a few days later. So let's talk about the Szilard Petition. And of course, we wanted to do this in part because of the new movie Oppenheimer, which is about the development of nuclear weapons. I got a chance to see it recently, and the Szilard Petition plays a pretty critical role in the movie. The whole movie, though, does a really impressive job, I thought, of painting the moral picture and the moral wrestling that the scientists in particular involved in developing this weapon had to take on. And the signing of this petition is kind of framed as one of the big moments, this last-ditch attempt by scientists, by some scientists, to really alert Truman about what was at stake. And there's a scene in which J. Robert Oppenheimer basically pushes away a clipboard with a petition on it, refusing to sign. But then there are other moments where we certainly see Oppenheimer very aware of and torn up by what he's about to unleash on the world. So we had planned to do this episode before I saw the film, and I was really intrigued to see that played a critical role in the film and consider this at least one person's endorsement of the movie and the way it takes on that moral dimension. But let's talk about the Szilard Petition. In particular, here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
So maybe let's start with the petition itself as a way to sort of paint all of the deep moral questions. Then we'll talk about Szilard as an interesting character. But Niki, do you have anything else that jumps out about what's in that petition other than what I read, that kind of we will bear the responsibility for devastation on an unimaginable scale? I mean, this is pretty heavy stuff.
It's pretty heavy stuff. It's pretty far-sighted, I think, in a lot of ways, to understand that there is both this decision that has to be made in this moment, and it will have certain consequences. People will die. The war may end. The war may not end. But it is also going to have consequences after this war. And I think that kind of farsightedness is not really all that usual in the middle of a heated battle, especially one that already is fraught with so many... so much morality. I mean, World War II is a war that we still think of almost exclusively in moral terms. And these scientists who too, I think, we don't normally think of scientists as thinking in moral terms. We think of that as like the realm of philosophers, and scientists just stick to the facts. So I'm particularly struck by both the farsightedness and the kind of, in a way, what feels like moving outside their field as a group of scientists.
One of the things I think is really interesting about this petition, too, is that he's not alone. He's not sort of like the person crying out in the wilderness. There are 70 other scientists and physicists who have come alongside him to say, hey, listen, we need to sound the alarm. This could have devastating ramifications. And what I think is also interesting on top of that is that the memo that he really wanted to get to the president was like, give Japan an option. Let them know what's coming. Because maybe we can stop this before it even happens. And that, I think, could have been really pivotal had Japan known that they were planning on not just making this bomb, but dropping this bomb.
I think that's right. This idea that if we let Japan know exactly what they're going to face, now there was a warning sent to Japan that you will face a weapon like no other, but to really understand what a nuclear weapon would do may not have been so clearly communicated. I mean, although, ultimately, whether or not Japan decides to surrender or doesn't decide to surrender, the morality still lays at the feet of the people who dropped the bomb.
Right. There is this specific recommendation in the letter, this tactical idea of let's reach out to the Japanese and tell them what's about to happen. But I think this larger moral plea is the really fascinating one to me. And I don't know, it's hard to overstate how deep this moral dilemma was in this moment. Obviously, this is one of the big counterfactuals in all of history, but it was being asked at the time, did the United States, quote unquote, need to drop the bomb? And what would have been the consequences had the United States not dropped that bomb? And, it's almost an impossible question. And to illustrate that a little bit, I just want to follow up on a related episode we did recently. I don't know if people remember, we did that episode on the development of napalm at Harvard. And we pointed out there that napalm was used in World War II and was behind a lot of the fire bombings that killed hundreds of thousands of people, more than were killed by nuclear weapons. And in that episode, we also pointed out that napalm would then go on to be used famously and infamously and horrifically in Vietnam. We got an email from a listener who kind of took us to task, I think, rightly so, for comparing that usage and kind of saying, look, the moral decisions in Vietnam and the moral decisions in World War II are just not to be elided and compared with each other just because the stakes were so different and the stakes were so much higher in World War II of not stopping Germany and then by 1945 not stopping Japan, which was killing so many people. And of course, that was the awful calculus that politicians were weighing. If we don't deploy this weapon, which we think could just stop this war with this huge show of force, what happens if this war goes on and kills more and more people? So I just found that really useful to understand the moment in which this letter is written.
And I think this is why having the scientists write this letter is so important, because they understand that it's not like napalm, that it is a categorically different kind of weapon that is being unleashed on the world, that is not just about an expansion in the amount of firepower that a military has, but actually raises existential questions. Right? Like the harnessing of the atom actually has ramifications far beyond the destruction of one bomb, right? It throws the world into crisis. It redefines the world, moves it into what was known at the time as the atomic age. And it led to a kind of, there's some poetry that's written around this time that captures the kind of instability that it introduces, because now everything's different after this technology has been developed. And these scientists, because they're the ones developing it, understand that better than anyone.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
It's interesting, too. I remember when I was teaching a course on American history, the second half of the survey, I used to use this book by Ronald Takaki called Why They Dropped the Bomb. And one of the major arguments that he makes is that race was a motivating factor, that the idea of difference and otherness and race plays a huge role in deciding whether or not to drop that bomb, and that if we're thinking about moral and ethical issues, race has to be a factor as well. Because if you can think of someone else as less than, or if you can think of someone as an other, you're less motivated in ways that only serve you well and not and that there should be some boundaries and real questions, hard questions about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think more than anything, what moves me here is that there's a real grappling with those questions. I mean, Szilard himself is for instance, points out, he at the same time advocates for we should develop this bomb before Nazi Germany does, which is a real fear still. And then he also has this sort of deep moral revulsion to dropping the bomb itself. And so somehow those two things can be true. I think with Oppenheimer, same sort of thing. he reportedly, I think it's mostly self-reported, said that famous line about when he saw the first testing, I've become destroyer of worlds or whatever it is, the quoting from. But we're both scientists and we're both moral actors and so forth. And I mean, I think a big part of this story of this petition itself, right, which Oppenheimer plays a role here, we should say, he kind of puts the word out and says, hey, to fellow scientists saying, don't put your name on this, right? There's a big back and forth about whether people should put their name on this, and Oppenheimer kind of tries to say, this is the realm of politicians, not our realm, But I think a big part of the story around this petition is this question of kind of when do the people who are actually at the front lines of developing these technologies start to ask these big questions. How do political actors listen to or not listen to these people? It almost reminds me of that episode we did on the Challenger, where you had this divide between the sort of bureaucrats and the scientists, right? And how does an organization bridge that divide and tackle really, really hard projects and listen to a whole range of voices? And so at the very least, I see this as just kind of a moment where someone's trying to step across that divide.
We're having this moment right now, sort of with AI. I mean, people are sounding the alarm about how artificial intelligence works and what are the consequences going to be? Are machines going to take over? Are they in ways that people can't, match? And, these are questions that I think start to pop up in a lot of different areas, not just when it comes to like war and defense, but how intelligence itself can be manipulated and used.
And there's a reckoning that's happening right at that time about science and ethics when it comes to eugenics, which was embraced broadly by many scientists in the 1920s and 1930s. It obviously gets discredited in the 1940s as the details of the Holocaust begin to come out. But this is a moment for thinking about the morality of science and how badly wrong it can go.
And there were consequences for taking a step like this and sort of raising an alarm in this way. So Szilard himself, we should say, was a Hungarian-born physicist, was really key in developing a lot of the steps along the way towards the development of a nuclear weapon. He wrote this memo kind of soon after witnessing a test bombing. And then after obviously the bombs are dropped, and after that, a lot of the folks who had signed this petition did continue working in the weapons industry, but, and this is part of the Oppenheimer story too, this legacy of sort of having taken this stand hangs over them, and they're not able to get security clearance. In Oppenheimer's case, he gets wrapped up in HUAC stuff and red baiting stuff. And so, it's just it's a real example of kind of when you take a moral stand, it lingers. It has consequences in this way.
In many ways, it is a precursor to everything that is to come with the Cold War and the Red Scare, right? It is a moment when people are being asked to make big decisions, to announce their beliefs, and when they do, there are political consequences for it. And since you mentioned HUAC, there are going to be new institutional ways to hold people accountable for speaking up.
Yeah. I think that's the hardest thing of this, is you wonder, like, what would have happened had the memo gotten through to the president? Had he actually been heard? Would we be living in an entirely different world? Those are questions we can't necessarily answer, but I do think that when we hear any alarms like this coming from the science world or the physics world or, NASA, like, these are questions that should give all of us pause, at the very least, before we make major decisions. Like, what is the harm in waiting? What is the harm in sort of de-escalating progress for a bit?
Yeah.
And it's worth noting, too, that, this is a memo that goes to, or this is an open letter that goes to Harry Truman. And I think one of the reasons we look at this moment as a moment of possibility and what ifs is Harry Truman had been vice president for a couple of months, and then he had been president for a couple of months when this decision lands on his desk. And so in a way, it's possible to imagine the scientists thinking, hey, here's a moment where we really can intervene. There's a brand new president. There's a lot of information coming at him all at once. Let's be part of the debate that's happening and get him up to speed, because we've known about this much longer than he has. Like, he didn't know any of this was going on. So we have a responsibility to read him all the way into the situation.
Yeah. Well, look, we're going to leave it there. I mean, obviously there is no shortage of reporting and counterfactuals and wrestling with this particular moment. I would say, largely speaking, I feel like, people were seeing the complexities. Really, we're wrestling in a way and seeing how complicated this all was. And I heard an interview with an author about of a book that just came out about this guy. Evan Thomas wrote this book about the last few weeks of the war. And one of the things he points out is, like, I think he paints a really nuanced and fair picture of how complicated all these decisions were. And he just basically says, look, wars are easy to get into and really, really hard to get out of.
Facts.
And so if you're going to kind of look at a situation like this, it's okay to understand that these were really, really tough decisions, But the real question is, how did you get in that situation to begin with? That's the lesson to carry forward.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if folks are interested in reading more about this, there is a very good book by Sarah Bridger called Scientist at War that looks at the role of scientists in policymaking, in nuclear research, and then the decision what to do now that you have those nuclear weapons. So that's a good extra reading if you're interested in more.
Cool. All right. Well, there we go. We will leave it there. Nicole Hammer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.